What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about the visuals of Modern Warfare 3 based on the beta, and how I feel there's quite a bit of room for improvement here. I think by default, if you don't use any filters or color correction or anything like that, by default, I think this game is a little on the ugly side. And honestly, even just a little bit of color correction goes a long way. Now, before we really get into this, of course, this is going to be a somewhat subjective video. When it comes to visuals and art style, people's preferences will vary. Also, this is obviously not a major complaint that I've got with the game right now. I'm much more concerned with things that directly impact the gameplay experience and the actual mechanics of the game. But in saying that, it definitely doesn't hurt to have a game look a little bit more visually pleasing. And I do think this is an area where there's quite a bit of room for improvement. I've seen a lot of people, especially now the PC beta is live, a lot of people showing off their different color correction settings that they're using. And I've been noticing with a lot of these, the game has a lot of potential to look a lot better with even just a few minor tweaks to things. And on that note, I do want to point out, with the gameplays that you see on my channel, you're actually seeing some color correction in action. I do this directly through my capture card. I boost the saturation a little bit, I boost my contrast a little bit, and I also slightly drop the brightness in my capture card. And therefore, if you're just looking at my gameplays, you might be thinking, this is a weird complaint, the game looks great. That's because you're not actually seeing the native look of the game through my capture card. And to me, ideally, you'd want to make it look better out of the box so everybody gets to experience this, not just PC players that have the ability to use filters on their game, or people that have capture cards like myself that allow us to make these fine adjustments. And getting into some details with this, I think the biggest issue here is it just seems like there's a little bit of a haze on the map all the time. And with this, things tend to look pretty washed out, and especially when you start looking at like somewhat longer ranges in multiplayer at least, this can actually affect character model visibility a bit as well. And I do think this was just an artistic choice of theirs, where they wanted things to look a little bit more like gritty and realistic, but at the end of the day, that's not the impression that I get out of this. The feeling that I get when I look at this is like flat and washed out and boring. Now, I do think this is an actual atmospheric setting that they added to the game, because when you're in an interior environment, you don't see that same sort of haze or fogginess to it. And I actually think inside most buildings in this game, the game looks significantly better than if you're outside the buildings. So if Sledgehammer is open to adjusting something, I think cutting down on that atmospheric fog a little bit would really go a long way into making the maps feel a bit more appealing and less flat looking. Now, you can get around this a little bit through filters or color correction by boosting contrast. That has a tendency to cut through that a little bit. So even if they don't make this adjustment, if you have the ability to put a filter on, bumping up your contrast setting does help with this area a bit. In saying that though, I'm not even sure if that would be enough. Another thing I've noticed with this game is out of the box, I feel like there's not a whole lot of color. Even though many of the maps like Favela, for instance, should have a whole lot of color, those colors aren't really vibrant. They don't really pop so much. And part of this might be tied to that previous thing I was talking about with that atmospheric fog. This may be muting the colors out a little bit more. And if they were to just cut down on that, maybe that would naturally boost the saturation and the colors a little bit. But in either case, I have noticed this is another area where when I boost my saturation, even just slightly, I try not to take it way overboard like I see some creators doing, but even just a subtle boost to the saturation, at least in my opinion, makes the game look significantly better as well. And honestly, those are the two biggest areas. If they were to make a couple adjustments there, I think it can make a huge difference on people's perceptions of the visuals of this game. I mean, you guys have been seeing me kind of fade back and forth between some very basic Photoshop color correction, where essentially I'm just boosting the contrast a little bit, maybe adjusting brightness a little as necessary with that contrast, and then also slightly boosting the vibrance or saturation a little bit. At least in my eyes, this makes the game look significantly better, a lot more appealing, and more like somewhere I want to be spending my time. While it may not look quite as like gritty or grungy as the native colors, I feel like it's just a lot more visually pleasing. There's more depth to the image, character models pop a little bit more, and it just seems to fit better with an arcadey style of game as well. I mean, even going back to, let's just say Modern Warfare 2019, because they have Rust in that game. If we compare the out-of-the-box native colors, again, no color correction here done whatsoever in my capture card, you can see there's not nearly as much of that washed-out feeling to the game. It doesn't feel like there's that persistent layer of fog everywhere, and I think this looks significantly better out of the box. And it's something that I feel like some minor tweaks could really go a long way here into just making the game generally more visually pleasing. Now, of course, like I said, this is quite subjective, but I am curious to hear from you guys, for instance, in those comments down below. What's your preference here? Do you prefer the non-color corrected version, the out-of-the-box colors that you're seeing, or the color corrected version of the images that I provided here? To me, the color corrected images look significantly better than the out-of-the-box images. At least if we're taking a big picture look at this. I will admit, with the color correction, sometimes it oversaturates certain elements just because there is that big discrepancy where there's some areas that by default do pop a fair amount, but I was just trying to make some of the other colors pop for illustration purposes. So I'm not saying it's flawless with this color correction, but I am saying a little bit of color correction can go a long way here. Now, since we're on the topic of things looking ugly in-game, there's another specific thing I wanted to bring up in today's video. It has nothing to do with like the color correction or anything though. In this case, this is to do with the fact that we have the new tactical stance feature in the game, and every single time you aim down sights, you have this big toggle tactical prompt right toward the center of your screen, right on top of your weapon model. And I really don't like the looks of this. It was handy to have at first, just to remind us of the fact that this is a new feature and something that you can do, but I'm over it. I know I can do this. I don't need to see that prompt every single time I aim down sights. At the very least, when it comes to this, I'd love to see an option to be able to just toggle this off. So the tactical stance would still work for you. Mechanically, nothing would change here. You would just no longer see this giant toggle tactical prompt pop up every single time you aim down sight. I think it's completely unnecessary, and it gets in the way a whole lot more than the mounting option. I know this is really similar to the mount prompt that you would see when you aim down sight near something that you can mount on, but that prompt was at least a little bit more localized. Also, I think they had it a bit lower on the screen as well, so it's not quite toward the center of your screen. So I never really found that as annoying as this new toggle tactical prompt. Now, part of me is thinking that they purposely made this a little bit bigger and right in your face just for the beta build of the game because they want to encourage people to try out this new mechanic, and that's just a constant reminder for people that are just getting into the game for the first time that this is something you can do. But I think by default they should be shrinking this a little bit, maybe moving it down on the screen slightly as well, just so it's a bit less obstructive. And on top of that, I would love to see an option in the menus for us to just disable this completely so we don't need to see it. And with that, that's pretty much it. While this is in no way like the biggest issue with the game or anything, I do think overall the game's looking a little more ugly than it needs to out of the box, and I don't think we should have to be using filters or making adjustments on our TVs or monitors to make the game look significantly better than it does natively. By default, I think the game should have a little more contrast than it currently does, and not so much of that foggy or hazy feeling to it. But of course, these are just my opinions, and I do want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, do you agree with me? Do you feel like the game by default just looks a little too washed out and there's not enough contrast there, or maybe a little too much atmospheric fog? Or do you maybe actually prefer that with it being a little bit more, I guess you could say, gritty? And second, what do you guys think about that toggle tactical prompt that pops up every time you aim down sight right in the middle of your screen? If they provided the option to remove this UI element while still maintaining the ability to go into a tactical stance, is that something you would toggle off? Or is that something that you would actually leave on? Do you prefer having that constant reminder there? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.